So we are talking in all these movements, or what the Germans call a Bewegung, of a whole culture, not just the cause. And I want to fill that little bit in within the limited time that I have. There is behind that a certain consensus, a certain basic understanding that if you are a pacifist, you will be predisposed also not to be brutal to animals at the very least, and not to eat them at the best. These are attitudes. You may accept them, you may reject them, but please bear in mind the cultural dimension that lies beneath these movements. They're not only movements against war, they're movements against a warring mentality, basically patriarchal in its origins, a warrior mentality. That's what they're really talking about deep underneath it all. The same thing is true of the so-called environmental movement, which I would prefer to call an ecological movement. And that is the idea that nature is not stingy, cruel, mute, and brute. That imagery today of the 19th century, where nature has to be controlled because we're dominated by nature, and if we don't dominate nature, nature will dominate us. You know that whole mindset. The idea behind the ecology movement, that one gets into its very core, is the idea, above all, that nature is rich and fecund, not stingy. Nature is not cruel. Nature is not even ethical. Nature is. And the most beautiful thing about nature is its innovative character, such that out of the shallow oceans of 4 or 5 billion years ago, life became so richly differentiated, so interconnected, so diversified, and so participatory at a time when we always stress the survival of the fittest and the antagonism and the hatred that a lion has for a zebra. That's its meal. So that type of imagery. Nature is participatory, basically speaking. Not a world, the free market world of rivalry. So behind that ecological mentality also lies a culture, and even lies a personality, a way of experiencing, a way, as it were, of absorbing the world around us and interacting with it. And I can go on endlessly. The feminist movement, with its attempt to recover the sororal relationship between women, not the fraternal relationship as it has been interpreted by the warriors for the past 5 to 6 and possibly 10,000 years. So there is a culture in all of these phenomena, and underlying it all is a certain consensus that makes it possible for people to come from a shared premise in order to arrive at an opinion or a conclusion or a judgment or a decision. Excuse me. How are we in 1985, and I'm going to be relevant, if I may, but I feel it's terribly important to establish the setting for all of this, going to begin to develop a movement, a Bewegung, as the Germans call it, a movement that will begin to reach the American people with all the multidimensionality that I've discussed, not only in terms of the forms of freedom, but also in terms of that culture, that substance that I impute to pacifism, that I impute to ecology, that I impute to feminism, that I impute to all the different specific movements, even anti-imperialism, that we are all in one way or another involved in, or in which we overlap with each other. How are we going to now move again in such a way, based upon the lessons we should learn from the 30s and the 60s, into forms of freedom, forms of organization, and with it a message that can reach the American people? And that is our most immediate problem. I think it's wonderful to go out to Nicaragua and collect coffee beans, but I think what the Nicaraguans want us to do is to get the American imperialism off their back. I remember people who went to Vietnam and talked to the Vietnamese, and the most important message they got is, please, we don't need you to fight for us. We have all the people we need. Do us a big favor, go home and win the American people. I'm sorry, did somebody want to say something?
What about the Stalinists in Nicaragua? How about getting them off their backs?
I'm prepared to open a whole discussion on that, but the one thing we want to do as Americans is get American imperialism off the backs of everybody and get Russian imperialism off the backs of everybody.
Imperialism starts at home too, Bernie. Come on.
I agree. But where is our home? Where do we live? In Nicaragua, or do we live in the United States?
Nicaraguans have home.
Right now, friends, the best thing we can do if we want to be anti-imperialists is to bring or terminate American imperialism as quickly as possible. That, I think, is terribly important. And I wish to emphasize the importance of that, if I may. So what I'm getting at is this. How can we reach the American people in terms that they can begin to understand? And this is a big problem for me, because in the 1930s, I talked to the American people in German, namely Marxism. And nobody was listening, except people who understood German, in a manner of speaking. And when German didn't work, I talked to them in Russian, namely in the form of Bolshevism. And the American people did not understand what I was saying. Not me, but most of us on the left. And then finally, during a certain period, let's say the early 60s, we started talking to them in Chinese, namely Maoism. And they didn't know what we were talking about. And then finally, in Vietnamese. And they didn't know what we were talking about. We have to recreate today a Bewegung or movement that will talk to the American people in a language they can understand, and the language is primarily, although not exclusively, English. Which is not to say that we can't learn from all the other experiences that occur, be they in Germany, be they in Central America, be they in other parts of the world. We should. But the thing that concerns me most deeply is that we reach the American people. And this is the big thing we have to learn out of our experiences in the 1960s, not to speak of the 1930s. Because I'm beginning to see a stirring taking place in the United States. I travel very extensively. I'm beginning to see a kind of revival. Maybe in the most nascent and incipient form, but something is beginning to happen again. And then I want to go back and I want to ask myself, how can I translate, and I speak only for myself, how can I translate my libertarian impulses and the libertarian traditions of the American people into a reality today? And here I think we come to a very crucial problem. We have to develop, in my opinion anyway, a politics which is not parliamentary, which is not a party politics, but a politics in the original Greek meaning of the term, not statecraft, because that's what we often mean when we talk about politics today. We mean statecraft, power. I don't mean self-empowerment. When we talk of statecraft, we mean parliamentary empowerment. And that is hogwash. I know of no corruptive influence today than getting elected to Congress or becoming President of the United States. In fact, let me tell you, in many cases, it's very dangerous to become mayor of a socialist city like Burlington. That is a separate problem. It's a very dangerous act, because politics in the form of statecraft operates by a law of negative selection. The worse you are, the more likely you are to get elected. The more demagogic you are, the more likely you are to be successful. And that's dangerous. And it is corrupting almost every parliamentary movement that I have seen, even the most well-intentioned, and including some of the most well-intentioned people. So what can we build on? Can we also work only with an extra parliamentary movement? We need one. We need one because it is not only an exercise and field in direct action where people think they are taking their destiny into their own hands, and often do. It's great to have a strike. It's great to have a blockade. It's great to have a demonstration. It's great to form cultural enclaves, to become squatters, to try to redeem areas and so on and so forth that have been abandoned by the cities and the like. But that too has to be translated into something more definite. And there was a way of doing it. In Spain, they took the extra parliamentary movement and turned it into trade unions called the CNT. Had 2 million members, got involved in a civil war, after which 1 million people died in the Civil War. I'm not saying that their strategy was right or wrong, but at least they institutionalized or organized their extra parliamentary movement. That's one alternative. The usual alternative, quite aside from Gandhi, was finally to rise in insurrection. Let's face it.